Welcome to Tigray Media House. My name is Maliti Brahana Meskel. After 237 days of genocide, June 28th was a turning point. The Ethiopian government had no choice but to declare a unilateral ceasefire. But that was only after the Tigray Defense Forces continued to take back towns, including the capital city of the north, Mekelle. People were in the streets cheering. Tegaru were able to come out and freely be outside. I spoke with someone on the ground who was ecstatic and just really jubilant. And she just kept saying, we're outside and we're not afraid. And that was largely the sentiment all over. So today we have Martin Platt with us. He is an expert on the Horn of Africa, and he's going to sort of talk about the things that have happened and got us to this point. So welcome to the show. Thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So tell us a little bit about what happened. We know that there was an operation called Operation Alula, where there were several successes. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also just in general, how did we get to this very dramatic turn of events?
Well, let me be absolutely honest with you. I was, obviously sympathetic to the Tigrayan cause when you were driven from Mekelle. I mean, it was there was no alternative a year ago. Sorry, not a year ago, last November, when it was absolutely vital that your forces left the city because, quite frankly, if you hadn't, the city would have been flattened by the Ethiopians and then by the Eritrean forces. They had sufficient air power, they had the artillery to do it, and your people had to leave. And I understood that. I spoke to some young women who were on the ground, and they said it was terrible because your forces spoke to elders and they explained why they were leaving and that they had to do it. And the people said they felt alone. They felt naked. They felt that they had been, not abandoned, but they said, we just thought there was nobody to look after us. And there was a terrible feeling, of that this was frankly going to be, if not the end, then a long, long, long war. I haven't forgotten that the last time took, what was it, something like 17 years before Tigrayan forces took Addis Ababa in 1991, and then obviously there were some pretty terrible times. I mean, your forces were forced out of Humera. They were left the large sections of Western Tigray, and the Eritreans attacked from the north. You were driven out of many towns and were forced to. Let's not bandy words around. We're forced to retreat into some of the most rugged and densely forested areas to continue the fight. But I still thought it was going to be a very, very long time. And gradually, and I still think it has to be explained how it was done. Gradually, you reformed your forces, and the TDF got stronger. And despite the fact that the Eritreans poured many troops, it wasn't just one offensive that they launched many, and they conscripted everybody that they could possibly round up. Whether it was they emptied the prisons, they conscripted children into Sawa with very little training and put them in the front lines. And I'm sure the same was done with the Ethiopian forces. And of course, you were facing the Amhara, you were facing some Somali troops as well. It was extraordinary. You were taking on the forces of 2, if not 3 countries plus a militia. And yet somehow your leaders, your generals, got your act together. And what was it? It's something like only 10 days ago, was it now 11 days? You moved from launching what were, raids and defensive engagements into an offensive. And I thought, well, that's pretty impressive. But I never dreamed for a moment that it was possible that you would sweep, frankly, everything before you. And I think that it's one of the real miracles of modern military warfare that you managed to turn it around so rapidly. And, I have been to one of the, also an extraordinary event, a place in Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu, which is on the border between Cambodia and Vietnam, where the Vietnamese, through extraordinary tactics, finally drove the French, who were embedded into Dien Bien Phu. They had massive fortifications. I've seen them of an airfield, and they eventually took it, and they captured Dien Bien Phu. And it was the end of the French in Vietnam. And we shouldn't forget also the Eritreans in Alphabet in 1988, where they took on an Ethiopian army and destroyed it. They destroyed 20,000 troops in an extraordinary heroic attack. So it is possible occasionally to undertake these operations, but clearly your forces were capable of doing it, and they did. And there was no alternative but for the Ethiopians to realize the game was up. And they landed. I mean, I believe, I'm sure you know much more than I do, but I mean, they landed in Antonov. They raided the banks. They raided the UN headquarters. They raided everything they could. They took everything they could, and I believe that they, just frankly ripped the place off, and then loaded their troops into a massive convoy and disappeared. The first I knew was when some of the prisoners, I was contacted by people who said, prisoners are actually no longer being held in prison there. Nobody should guard them. And I got these messages, and people saying, they've gone. They've gone.
Wow.
I don't know how it happened. It's amazing.
It was shocking. I think so many of us were shocked, and this was over 10 days. And talk about specific numbers if you have more updated numbers than I do. But I'll tell you, from what I heard, more than 28,000 soldiers, that would be federal soldiers, Eritrean soldiers, were killed in the span of that 10 days. More than 10,000 prisoners of war are currently in custody. And by the way, Operation Alula, you briefly kind of mentioned on it, Operation Alula, Ras Alula was the general, the heroic general who helped defeat the Italians. And so that's who this operation was named after. Are those the numbers that you're hearing?
I thought they're in the same sort of area. But I mean, let me be honest with you. I have, in this context, I know nothing more than your own forces have put out. There are no independent verification of these numbers. But I mean, while people were extremely skeptical about what the TDF was saying early on, gradually, you've got to come to the position where you've got to believe that that it's true, because in the end, if people are proved right, well, then you've got to start believing them. And I mean, the one thing I would say is this is not over. There is a huge amount to do. And although it's clear that a lot of the northern towns, the Eritreans have gone, Shire, I believe, as you've captured, and other towns in the north. But there is still a huge amount to be done. And, I don't know. I mean, what do you hear about Humera?
I haven't heard that Humera has been taken back yet. I haven't heard that. But what I do know is that you're right. We keep hearing that, the information that's coming out of Tigray from Tigrayans, be it the average everyday person or what's happening on the battlefield, is constantly not believed. We're told that we were told the rape wasn't happening. We were told the executions weren't happening. We were told now that, TPLF is dead, or, there is no TDF, and everything is, the Ethiopian government is in charge. And then time and time again, what comes from the people in Tigray turns out to be true. What do you think was the big turning point? I'll tell you what I thought and what I saw. What I saw was that people were joining the fighters in droves. I mean, I was shocked. It wasn't unlike the Ethiopian side, where people are joining because they need a paycheck perhaps and don't even really know maybe what they're getting into. On the side of Tigrayans, you had academics who were joining, you had teachers, you had award-winning directors who were joining, you had models, young women, young adults who joined because they felt like they had no choice. If they stayed home, they were raped. If they, if they're women, if they're boys and they stayed home, they were likely executed or, being abused, kept in underground jails. I mean, it seemed like people joined in droves, and it seemed like that was a big turning point in the fighting. What's your take on that?
I think you're right. But there's also a warning in that, because I have heard discussions recently. Getachew was quoted as saying that maybe we'll go on to Eritrea, we'll go on to Asmara. Now, I would caution against that. Not because I don't think that President Isaias deserves to be, shall we say, to pay for the atrocities that are being committed, and the for basically getting involved in a war, which frankly he plotted, and this is the key point. He plotted this with Prime Minister Abiy for months before it happened, for months. And he got in President Famajo involved as well. So I mean, I'm not saying that he doesn't deserve to be held to account for his actions, but just as you fought with unbelievable heroism, your people fought on their own turf for their own people. Once you cross into Eritrea, the boot will be on the other foot. And particularly once they get into the mountains, the Eritreans will fight with the same determination. And so, I mean, listen, I'm not trying to tell anybody how they should conduct what they should do. In the end, it is, people, you must make up your own minds. But I would just be cautious about it. And, just as the point that you've made, that people, when they're on their own territory, their own turf, and they know what the price is of losing, and the price was death, or worse, then they will fight with extraordinary tenacity. But frankly, the Eritreans would probably do the same. And, while as the diaspora, the Eritrean diaspora, of course, is divided, because some of the Eritrean diaspora has always supported President Isaias, and, I don't underestimate that. My view is that many people in the diaspora are enormously supportive of the Tigrayan cause when you fight for your own independence. But you cross the border, and then they have to think about it. And just as your opposition joined, as far as I can tell, listen, I'm not on the ground, but I mean, almost to a man and woman, joined the TPLF because they knew that this was, do or die for your nation. The problem is you pose the same questions for the Eritreans if you cross into Eritrea. Now, as I say, I'm not trying to be prescriptive. I'm just saying be careful. I have friends who are Eritreans who have been in jail for, I think, 20 years now without being charged in Eritrea. I would love to see Eritrea free, democratic, peaceful, and not run by this Isaias, who is, I don't know how to describe him. But the man is surely one of the worst dictators that the world has at the moment. I would love to see the back of him, but
absolutely,
it's not for me to say. It's for the people of the Horn of Africa to say, and I just say be careful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Isaias Afwerki is very wicked, and there are, issues in his own country, obviously, that those people need to deal with. I know that there is a feeling among Tigrayans, though, that there will never be peace with Isaias Afwerki at the helm. So you do raise an interesting point of what happens next, and how is that handled. What are you hearing about? Because let's be honest, this unilateral ceasefire that Abiy Ahmed has called is probably pretty controversial with Isaias Afwerki, who would love to see, certainly the TPLF, if not Tegaru in general, completely annihilated. So I'm sure that ceasefire didn't sit well with him. Not that Abiy Ahmed had a choice, since so many of his forces were destroyed. But what do you think? What does the ceasefire mean in relation to Eritrea? That doesn't mean the Eritrean troops have left. I mean, and we know that most of Tigray still is occupied. It's not been completely freed. And also, what are you hearing from the streets? As far as I can tell, there's a little bit of chaos in Asmara right now in terms of Isaias Afwerki and where he is and what he's doing and how much control he does or doesn't have. Now, I know he's notorious for playing those kind of games to try and trick people. But what are you hearing from the streets related to what's on the ground in Eritrea?
Let me be honest, at the moment, I'm not hearing anything. You've got to be really lucky to get a solid report out of Asmara or anywhere in Eritrea. I occasionally get snippets, but it's really hard to know. I mean, don't forget that he has one of the most effective secret services. I mean, every village, every family is penetrated, and people are just so fearful of what is going on. The other thing is that he has a whole department, 03, which is designed to spread false information, and he uses that to attack his enemies. But when an army is defeated and has to return home, it's a very dangerous moment for any government, any regime. And I think that obviously must weigh heavily on him and on and Prime Minister Abiy, because they both now are in a situation where they have, if not complete defeat, then very substantial reverses. But I mean, the ceasefire is a bit, I find, a weird idea. You can't have one side launching a war, then when things are going badly, suddenly say, "Oh, whoops, ceasefire." It just doesn't work like that. I mean, and there's an analogy that I use, which is not absolutely accurate, but it sort of it makes some sense. You may remember during the Second World War, after the Battle of Stalingrad, when the Russian forces, the Soviet forces, through extraordinary bravery, defeated the Nazis in the Battle of Stalingrad. And, I think it was von Paulus, who was completely surrounded, was finally forced to give up a field marshal, something that never happened in German history. But you can't imagine if Hitler had suddenly said, "Oh, we're just going to have a unilateral ceasefire." Do you think for a moment that the Soviet Union would have said, or that the West and would have allowed Hitler to survive because he had a ceasefire? I mean, that would have been crazy. I mean, there was a determination to prosecute the war to the end, and so, and I mean, I'm not trying to sort of say that the Tigrayans should now attempt to take Addis Ababa again. I mean, doing that once was enough. And let's not forget that Addis Ababa was taken with EPLF forces in alliance with them, and it was a. I mean, there's nothing quite as strange as the history of the Horn of Africa, where unfortunately you have these. Sometimes you have an alliance, sometimes you don't, and sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. The situation is as it is, but you're going to have to. Your leadership is going to have to make some very difficult and hard decisions, and I'm not. It's not my role to prescribe to anybody what they should do, but it seems to me that the biggest question now is how do you stop the occupation is of course number one, but number two, and it's right up there, is how do you stop the famine?
I think that's absolutely, and we shouldn't lose sight of that as well, that people are still starving. That has not changed at this point. You make a good point, though, because as far as I know, the government of Tigray, which has been releasing statements, has not said that they agree to this ceasefire. Now, we know he called it a unilateral ceasefire, but as far as we know, a statement hasn't come out, saying that they would not continue their efforts to liberate all of Tigray. So it's actually, an important point that we're missing. Also, I know that there are rumors that fighter jets had landed in Bahir Dar. So the whole idea of a ceasefire too is a little bit confusing, because it doesn't mean it's over. It just means we're going to stop for a minute. You know what I mean? And so what does that mean exactly? So you can regroup and get more troops and then come back in? I mean, what does it mean? I think there's all of these unknown things right now. One thing I will tell you is I've been watching a lot of the government accounts, various Amhara leaders and also other Ethiopian official leaders, and how they're digesting this. And that's been really, really interesting to see. And it feels like there's a number of them are turning on Abiy and saying things like, how dare you? We came to this point. How dare you, not continue, as if it's their children who are being sent out like cannon fodder to be killed. Have you noticed that?
I haven't been watching Ethiopian television. I must be honest. I mean, I don't speak an Ethiopian language, so it would be incredibly difficult for me to watch it. I have to wait for people to translate bits and pieces and try and put them in some kind of context. But I mean, the question now is then, how do you get the aid into Tigray? Because it seems to me that there are some really important things that have to happen. One of them, for example, is that the ports of Eritrea should be opened. Massawa and Asmara should be opened so that the World Food Programme and other organizations can bring the food into there, and that the truckloads of food and other assistance can roll up towards northern Tigray. Why should it not happen? It happened during the 84-85 famine. It should happen again. The road through to Sudan should be opened so that you have a direct route for aid to flow independently of anybody directly into Tigray. Because, that happened again during the 84-85 famine. And the roadblocks which have been preventing the convoys that are already trying to feed the people from Ethiopia, those roadblocks must be lifted, and there must be unhindered access to Tigray so that the assistance can come in. A harvest has been lost. People have been forced off their land. They were unable to plant. It's just appalling what has happened. I mean, food stores were raided. Farmers were killed. There is a desperate need. And, I lived through and, helped report on the 84-85 famine. I cannot bear the idea of another 400,000, 500,000 people dying. I mean, that is unbearable. We cannot allow that to happen. And, there have been some suggestions of food airdrops going in. Airdrops bring in tiny quantities of grain. They can be useful for medicines. They can help in absolutely extreme circumstances, but that is not the way forward. The way forward is to get those huge convoys rumbling, and I don't care where the hell they come from, but they need to arrive to where the people need it so that they are not allowed to starve. This would be just an absolute tragedy. And what will your government do if they are left with a population that they've liberated but can't feed? I mean, this is going to be appalling. I mean, I wouldn't wish to have the responsibility, whoever it is in your administration, who has the responsibility to now try and get the aid through to the people, because the responsibility is vast. And I know people will, of course, share whatever they have, and they will try and make things go, but there is only so much food that you go around. The food has to come in from the rest of the world, and that is an absolute priority.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I lost my great grandmother in the famine of 84. Her name was Fetienne. And I didn't even learn that until recently, once this war on Tigray started. So a very serious issue that is a generation or two away. We experienced this, so it's not. It is serious. We know that the number that keeps coming out is 350,000 people are in famine, but we know that the number is much larger. And I wonder if it's a strategy for the government of Tigray to continue working their way west so that they can open up the route through Sudan. I just don't. It doesn't seem like we'd be able to go through Eritrea, given all the tension and given the uncertainty with Isaias Afwerki, who could care less for his own people, let alone the people in Tigray. So I wonder if that's part of their strategy as they move to liberate going west. I guess that remains to be seen. But we do know, as the government and Eritrean forces were retreating, that they Aid workers have been killed. Recently there were the 3 aid workers that were killed. And I think that brings the total to 12 since the war on Tigray began, who have been killed in Tigray. And those were with Doctors Without Borders. We know that they were seen, as they retreat, these soldiers have been seen with cars and trucks filled with goods. And so they continue to devastate and continue to take from the people, even as they leave. I heard that there was a shooting at Mekelle University and people were killed as the soldiers were retreating. I also heard about the attempt to rob a bank, but the soldiers attempted to rob a bank, but apparently there were TDF forces who were outside and were able to stop them. I haven't been able to verify that, but that's something that we heard from people on the ground. And so far, everything they've told us has been true. So I wouldn't be surprised if that did actually happen. So right now I know people they're out cheering and they're celebrating and they're taking a deep breath, but I know people are also afraid that Mekelle could be a target, that a bomb could be dropped. And that's not an unfounded fear. I mean, they bombed Togoga just recently on Market Day and people were killed. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a valid concern? And then also, what are you watching for? What are the next things that you're looking for?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, yes, it is. It is an enormous concern. Returning to the cities, of course, makes the cities themselves targets. While the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces were in control of those cities, why would they bomb them? They wouldn't do it. But now that they no longer control them, they are targets for being bombed. And I mean, I'm not a military expert, so I can't tell you what kind of weaponry the Ethiopians or the Eritreans have. I mean, strangely, I actually many years ago spoke to an Eritrean pilot who, you may remember that in the border war, there was a bombing of Mekelle by a pilot. I actually spoke to the pilot who undertook that bombing and was instructed by SARS to do it. So it has been done in the past. It could be done again. I don't know what defensive weapons you have. Clearly, you've shot down some aircraft, and perhaps you could. Perhaps the air forces are wary of making those attacks now. But that is something that would be really difficult to predict. So I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question.
I just want to know what you're watching for next in terms of how this develops.
I mean, I think that the next thing that is happening is, look, whatever one thinks of the unilateral ceasefire and the retreat of the forces from Mekelle and other towns, it is a point. It is an opening where the international community can and should intervene. Let's not forget that the African Union tried really early and really quite effectively. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, met with the president of Ethiopia, and they came up with a strategy. They had 3 mediators ready to go and get the process rolling. And it was blocked by Prime Minister Abiy. He just said, no, we're not allowing them to mediate. There's nothing to mediate about. This is a law and order operation, which was, shall we say, slightly wide of the mark. So, I'm sure the African Union is trying again now, because this is an opportunity. I'm quite sure that the United States is also, with Feltman is the special envoy from President Biden. I'm sure that he is using every strategy to try and get some kind of negotiation process going, because, that is what is required now. We now need to move from the war. Once the last, occupying forces have left or been driven out, there need to be negotiations. And the first thing that has to happen, of course, is that the TPLF has to be removed from the list of organizations considered to be terrorist groups. It was a damn stupid idea to put them on in the first place. And the idea that nobody ever talks to terrorists is just, in any case, is absolute nonsense. You only have to look at the talks that they were held in Britain between the British government and the IRA in Ireland. I mean, there was always back channels. They were always negotiating, and they were always even though they said they weren't. So, I mean, leaving aside whether or not the TPLF is considered a terrorist organization, which was, as I said, I think was a mistake. Those talks should begin, and they through intermediaries or however, there should be negotiations about how to resolve the issues and how to find a status for Tigray which is applicable. And now I know that there are a lot of questions that have to be answered. I mean, let's just go through a few of them. Should Tigray remain as part of Ethiopia? Now, I haven't forgotten that many years ago, the TPLF fought and stood for the independence of Tigray. And it took, was it 6 weeks of discussions and lengthy negotiations for Meles to persuade the fighters that no, they would actually go on and, take the whole of Ethiopia and go on to Addis Ababa. It's not for me to suggest what the right status is for Tigray. That is for Tigrayans to decide and for Ethiopians to consider. This is not an issue for me in any shape, way, or form. And I would never. The one thing I've always said is I have no stand on the politics of Tigray, of Ethiopia, or Eritrea. The people must make their own things. All I stand for and I would support are ways that find through the political messes, and I point out the problems. That's all I can do. I can't do any more. I'm not from the Horn of Africa. It's not my role. So it's up to you to decide where your status is. And, you also have to deal with the really difficult issues. For example, the border has been adjudicated. It was adjudicated after the Algiers Treaty with in the 1998 to 2000 border war. The Algiers peace treaty allowed for the Boundary Commission. The Boundary Commission ruled where the border now is, and the border not only goes through villages, it goes through farmlands. It awards chunks of Irob to Eritrea. It awards Badme to Eritrea. Are you going to live with that? I have no idea. These are hard questions. The people of Irob, I think, would be absolutely incandescent if they were told they are, after all that they have suffered. And I've heard terrible stories about Irobi women being actually forcibly abducted by the Eritrean forces, and of IDs being distributed there and all sorts of things. So they clearly were planning to be there forever. Now I have no idea whether who controls Irob. I just don't know. But what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about the lands that the Amhara believe are theirs? You can find all sorts of shapes of maps of Tigray, and you have, whatever you do, you have to live with your Amhara neighbors, and how are you going to deal with that? Now, you need the judgment of Solomon to come up with a solution that will suit everybody, and sure as heck, everybody is going to be pretty unhappy, because if you have a just solution, it will be one in which everybody gives up something. Now, how are you going to deal with those? I have no idea. But between the international community, wise leadership, hopefully on the part of your leaders, and perhaps some of them, the wiser heads in Addis Ababa and Bahada and all the others, perhaps you can come up with a solution. Because, the one thing is for sure, you're never going to have any other neighbors other than the Sudanese, the Amhara, the Eritreans, and all the others. They're going to be your neighbors for the rest of time. They tried to wipe you out, and they failed. And thank God for that. But you're not going to get rid of your neighbors. And many years ago, after a terrible event in Israel and Palestine, I went to a Palestinian friend of mine who was working in the BBC with me, and I said to him, "I'm really sorry. This is just terrible what's happening." And he turned to me and he said, "Look, in the end, we are doomed to live with each other, and the same is true for you and all of your neighbors. You are doomed to live with each other. Like it or lump it, there ain't any other way round." So somehow wise heads have to come together, and I would wish all strength to anybody who has a way of dealing with it. As I say, it's nothing for me to say. All I point out is one needs a way through this mess.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think those are all important political questions, like you said, the annexed land. You know, you could even go further with everything that's the things that have been looted, and how do you deal with that? And you're right, TPLF was the most Ethiopianist party in Tigray. And so now, that question is most certainly going to come up again in terms of what do you do now? I mean, that's going to be an interesting conversation. But I do think that you pointed out correctly that the focus right now is the famine, is how do we get aid to the people? How do we help women who have been gang raped to the point their spines have cracked, and so much trauma and pain that needs to be dealt with immediately, before you can even get to those sort of political questions, although it is all intertwined. Definitely. And yes, you can't pick your neighbors. Unfortunately, they're there. But I will say that I often don't see the people as being the problem necessarily. Now, I know that's going to be an unpopular thing to say, because I think a lot of Tegaru right now feel like, we do feel like we're attacked because of our identity, especially from our neighbors to the south. However, I'm not sure that, for example, the average Eritrean person and the average Tegaru have the hate that's being forced down their throats from the top. And so I do think that there is an opportunity there, once there are some reparations made and some grievances, addressed, to hopefully tie some of this back together so we can, at the very least, live amongst each other. So really interesting, really interesting conversation, and so much to watch. Clearly you see Tigrayans celebrating, but I know that, it's a difficult thing, because freedom should always be celebrated, and that's what they're celebrating. However, there's so much pain, and there's so much fear, and there's so much anxiety, and this is far from over. When I think about what the people are going through, I think about who's hungry and who's dying, and who's, not able to access aid, and who's not able to access help. So, I think about the videos that are coming out still, with more information about people being, executed. I saw an older man with a gabi around his body, who was shot and thrown over that cliff. And, I think about their families. They couldn't identify the remains. They were looking for familiar clothing and, ID cards and things. So, this is so far from over. And yes, the people were jubilant, but it was a sigh of relief. The people could breathe for even just a moment. And so I thank you for your insight and for following this and sharing your thoughts with us. This is really important and really powerful. And I think the next couple of days are going to be really telling about the direction that all of this goes, and where the supply route comes from. So thank you, Mr. Platt. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Yes, just one point, which is perhaps a hopeful example. And if one looks at the relationship between the French and the Germans, between the Franco-Prussian War of I think it was 1870, you then had the First World War, you had the Second World War. I mean, they fought themselves to an absolute standstill for over nearly 100 years. Just the most appalling wars that dragged in the whole of the world. And yet, you look at the way in which the French and the Germans, the biggest wars they fight now on the football pitch. Kids play together, they live together, they go to each other's universities as if there's never been a problem. So these things can be resolved, they can be overcome. It takes wise heads and time. And and then the process of healing can occur. But this is not going to be easy, and I can only say I wish you and your people and your leadership all the luck in the world in trying to overcome this. And the one thing I promise you is that I will go on trying to work on this, and that with you're not alone. There are a lot of people in Britain, America, and other places, and the people in the Eritrean diaspora, for example, whom I work with, who have been so hurt by what the Eritreans have done, in the Eritrean forces have done in their name, so to speak. They are absolutely, twisted up inside themselves. So, people know what happens, and with a fair wind, this maybe, I hope, will be the last of these terrible conflicts, but we'll have to see.
Absolutely. I think there's been a feeling among Tegaru, that no one will save Tegaru but themselves, and I think that was what you saw, that jubilation on, day 237, that it was Tigray Defense Forces who ultimately are liberating, city by city by city. However, you're right. There are a number of people in the diaspora, people like you, several, like you said, Eritreans, and I'll even say I've seen people of various Ethiopian backgrounds, especially among my Oromo friends, who have been speaking up and against what's happening. So there is hope and there is light at the end of the tunnel. This is certainly a much brighter day in the last 8 months. So we'll keep watching, and we'll keep focusing on the people. We'll keep focusing on the famine and the immediate needs that our people have. So thank you, Mr. Platt.
It's a pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.